I never thought I would return to this village. A small, remote place I left behind years ago. Back then, I had clear reasons. There was no future here. But now, I had returned for reasons I couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was childhood memories, or maybe it was the curiosity that had haunted me for so long. The village was eerily silent. No sounds of life, just the whisper of wind brushing through ancient trees and the cracking of broken branches. I walked along the narrow path leading to my grandfather's old house, where I planned to stay the night. The house sat at the edge of the village, far from the others. As a child, I always felt something was off about this house. The sky had darkened by the time I arrived. The wooden front door creaked softly as I opened it, as if welcoming me back with invisible hands. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and rotting wood. Nothing had changed. Family photos still hung on the walls, but one in particular made my skin crawl. It was a picture of my grandfather, smiling, but his eyes seemed to stare directly into my soul. I shook off the feeling and tried to calm myself. That night, I decided to sleep in my grandfather's room. Oddly, despite the darkness and the quiet, I felt safer there. After closing the window and making sure the door was locked, I lay down on the old bed that groaned under my weight. As the night wore on, a sense of unease crept over me. The air in the room grew cold, colder than it should have been. I woke up with a heavy feeling on my chest. My breath came in short gasps, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Inside the house. I froze, my body stiff. The footsteps were slow, but clear, coming from the hallway and moving closer to the room. I tried convincing myself it was just the old house settling, creaking with age. But the sound was too deliberate, too real. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I didn't dare move. I barely dared to breathe. The door creaked open slightly, and through the narrow gap, I saw nothing, but I knew something was standing on the other side. Suddenly, the air became even colder, and I heard a whisper. A voice I vaguely recognized, though it was far from the comforting memories of my childhood. It was old, raspy, filled with hatred. Why did you come back? I shut my eyes, praying this was just a nightmare. But the whisper grew louder, clearer. You shouldn't have returned. Gathering every ounce of courage, I opened my eyes and turned toward the door. And there, I saw it, a shadowy figure, barely visible, but unmistakably human. Its face was hidden in darkness, but its eyes burned with a furious hatred. I screamed and tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. It felt as if an unseen force was holding me down, pinning me to the bed. The shadow loomed closer, and I felt a coldness, so intense it seemed to seep into my bones. Just as the figure was about to touch me, the light in the room suddenly flickered on. I gasped, and the shadow vanished as quickly as it had appeared. My heart pounded, my body drenched in cold sweat. I couldn't sleep again that night. Every sound, every flicker of shadow sent chills down my spine. I knew I wasn't alone in this house, and when the morning finally broke, I packed my things and left without looking back. But the whisper still haunts me. You will return. Weeks had passed since that night, but the memory lingered like a shadow over my every thought. I tried to shake it off, convinced myself it had been a mix of stress, exhaustion, and an overactive imagination. Yet, deep down, I knew something far more sinister had taken place in that house. Back in the city, life resumed as usual. The familiar noise of traffic and the routine of daily tasks kept my mind occupied. But at night, when everything quieted, I could still hear the whisper. You will return ... It would creep into my dreams, growing louder with each passing night. The figure, the cold presence in that house, seemed to reach for me through the darkness of my sleep. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, as if I had been standing once more in that cursed house, trapped beneath its icy gaze. Then, one evening, I received a call from an unknown number. Hesitant, I answered. The voice on the other end was soft, almost familiar. "Is this the grandson of Pak Soya?" the woman asked. My heart skipped a beat. Pak Soya was my grandfather. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "Who is this?" "This is Rati, your grandfather's old neighbor. I'm sorry to bother you, but you need to come back. Something has happened." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't spoken to anyone from the village since I left, and Rati's voice sounded strained, as if she was holding back something terrible. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "It's about the house," she whispered. "We've been hearing noises. People have seen things. We think it's your grandfather." I froze. My grandfather had been dead for years. "That's impossible. I know how it sounds," she said, her voice trembling, "but strange things have been happening. Please, you need to see for yourself." Despite every instinct screaming at me to refuse, I knew I couldn't ignore it. Something had been pulling me back to that village, and now, the call felt like the final push. 2 days later, I found myself driving back to the village. The landscape, once familiar, now felt distant and unwelcoming. Trees loomed larger, casting long shadows over the narrow road as dusk began to fall. The air was thick with humidity, and the closer I got, the more the pit in my stomach grew. By the time I arrived at my grandfather's house, the sun had almost disappeared behind the hills. Rati was waiting for me outside, her face pale and worn, as if she hadn't slept in days. Without a word, she motioned for me to follow her inside. The house felt different this time, colder, darker. The air was stifling, and every step I took felt heavy, as though the floor itself was trying to pull me down. Rati led me to the living room, where several villagers had gathered. Their faces were drawn and full of fear. One of the older men stepped forward. "There's something in this house. Since you left, it hasn't stopped." "What do you mean?" I asked, though deep down, I already knew the answer. The man pointed to the hallway leading to my grandfather's old room. "At night, we hear him walking. We hear his voice. Sometimes we even see him. But it's not your grandfather anymore. It's something else." A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I had thought the shadow, the presence I felt that night, was a nightmare. But these people were living it every day. I didn't want to go back into that room, but I had no choice. Whatever this was, it had drawn me here for a reason. Armed with nothing but a flickering flashlight, I stepped into the hallway, Rati and the others staying close behind. The door to my grandfather's room was slightly ajar, just like the night I fled. I could feel the cold air seeping out, and my heart pounded in my chest as I pushed it open. Inside, the room looked and touched just as I'd left it, but there was something new. On the wall, above the old bed, someone or something had carved deep marks into the wood. They formed strange symbols, ones I couldn't recognize, but they filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then, I heard it, the whisper, "You shouldn't have come back." It was louder now, more distinct, but this time, it wasn't alone. There was another voice, overlapping with the first. It was deeper, more guttural, as though it came from the depths of the earth itself. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered and died, and panic surged through me. The cold intensified, wrapping around me like icy hands. I tried to move, but something was holding me in place. Then I saw them. In the corner of the room, shadows began to take form. At first, it was just the silhouette of a man, my grandfather. But as the shadows twisted and writhed, they grew. They stretched unnaturally tall, and the figure's face twisted into a grotesque smile, eyes glowing with malice. Behind him, other shapes emerged, dark, faceless figures, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. Their voices filled the room, drowning out my thoughts. I could feel them pulling me closer, suffocating me with their presence. Just as I thought I couldn't breathe, couldn't escape, Rati grabbed my arm and yanked me back. The room suddenly filled with light again, and the figures vanished, leaving only the cold and silence behind. "We need to leave," she gasped, pulling me toward the door. Now, as we stumbled out of the house, I turned back one last time. Through the window, I could still see the shadows moving, and in the faint glow of the moonlight, I could swear I saw my grandfather standing in the doorway, watching us. But this time, it wasn't him. "You will return," the whisper echoed in my mind, as the house slowly faded into the night. And I knew, no matter how far I ran, it was only a matter of time. For weeks after that night, the village haunted my every waking moment. I tried to return to my life, to forget the shadowy figures, the voices, and the cold grip that still seemed to linger around my heart. But the whisper, always the whisper, followed me everywhere. "You will return." No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the truth was undeniable. The village hadn't let me go, not really. It was waiting for me, calling me back with every breath I took. One evening, after yet another sleepless night, I realized what I had to do. There was no escaping it. Whatever was in that house, whatever my grandfather had left behind, had bound itself to me. I couldn't live like this, half a man, constantly looking over my shoulder, fearing the shadows in every corner. So, I made my decision. I packed my things and began the journey back to the village, knowing this time would be different. This time, there would be no leaving. I wasn't coming back to escape. I was coming back to end it. The road was even more desolate than I remembered. The trees seemed to loom higher, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers, blocking out the setting sun. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the village itself knew I was returning for the last time. When I arrived, the streets were empty. No one came to greet me, not even Rati. I hadn't called ahead, hadn't warned anyone of my arrival. Somehow, I knew this was a journey I had to make alone. The house stood at the edge of the village like a waiting predator, dark and silent. The front door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside. The air was frigid, as though the house had been untouched for centuries, frozen in time. I made my way to my grandfather's room, flashlight in hand. But this time, there were no whispers, no footsteps echoing through the halls. The house was eerily silent, as if it too was holding its breath. The symbols on the wall were clearer now, glowing faintly in the dark, and the coldness in the room seemed to seep into my bones. I stood there, staring at the place where I had seen the shadows, waiting. And then, it happened. The temperature plummeted. My breath formed clouds of mist in front of me, and the room was plunged into an unnatural darkness. My flashlight flickered, but I kept it steady, pointing it at the corner where the shadows had first appeared. Slowly, the darkness began to coalesce, forming the familiar shape of my grandfather. His face was clearer now, more real, but twisted with a malevolent smile. His eyes, once warm and kind, were now pits of endless blackness. But this time, I didn't run, I didn't freeze. I had come to face whatever this was, and I wouldn't leave until it was over. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking but steady. The figure didn't speak at first. It only stared at me with that twisted grin. Then, in a voice that was both familiar and horrifying, it whispered, "You should never have returned." The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as the shadow of my grandfather grew taller, darker. The other figures began to emerge, their whispers filling the air like a cacophony of voices from beyond. But this time, I was ready. I had brought something with me. From my bag, I pulled an old journal, my grandfather's. I had found it in the attic just before I left the city, hidden among old papers. Inside were notes, scrawled in his shaky handwriting, describing the rituals and symbols he had used in his final days. He had been trying to stop something ancient and evil, buried beneath the village. But he had failed. Now, it was up to me to finish what he had started. With trembling hands, I began reciting the words I had memorized from the journal, words in a language I didn't understand, but felt deep in my soul. As I spoke, the symbols on the wall began to glow brighter, and the shadows in the room writhed in agony. The figure of my grandfather screamed, its voice splitting the air like thunder. The ground beneath my feet shook, and for a moment, I thought the house would collapse. But I kept chanting, louder and louder, as the shadows twisted and shrieked, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The coldness that had gripped the house began to lift, replaced by a warmth I hadn't felt since I'd first returned. The shadows faded, the whispers silenced, and finally, the figure of my grandfather dissolved into nothingness, leaving me alone in the room. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the house was quiet. I stood there, trembling and sure of what had just happened. But I knew one thing for certain: it was over. The curse, the evil that had haunted my family, was gone. As I walked out of the house for the final time, the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon. The village, once shrouded in darkness, seemed peaceful now, almost welcoming. I took one last look at my grandfather's house, its windows dark and empty. The whisper was gone, and so was the fear. I had returned, but now I was free.